Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our visit with Harold Kemp and the North that he remembers. And at our last program, we left off where he was moving his family back to Prince Albert. I think we were around Waskesiu, were we not?
That's
with
right.
The kids. And shall we pick it up there, Harold? You're
Okay.
heading back to
That's
civilization, I think you said.
That's right. Yes, we, you remember, we couldn't come across the road from Montreal Lake at 20 miles. The road is so bad that one Indian drowned a horse in the muskeg there, so we had to take 2 days and come up that crooked Waskesiu River. Well, yes, we're at Waskesiu, and I was a little perturbed. How am I going to get out of here? We figured on taking team right through, you see, but we had a bit of luck. There was an Indian camp there, and he was going home, but he heard about this road, and he just didn't know what he would do, whether he'd chance it or not. So we took care of him. I hired him to take us to Prince Albert, which he did. And the next morning, we put our stuff with the kids in the wagon and what fur we were bringing out with us, you know, and shook hands with our 3 canoemen, climbed aboard the wagon, and we go down the road. And about 100 yards down the road or so, there's the first bend in the trail, and we look back, and here are Indians, bye-bye, bye-bye. And we waved back to them, and then the bend of the trail cut them off. And boy, that was an emotional moment again, you know. We weren't saying so much goodbye to our friends there, but we were saying goodbye to the North itself, you know. And,
Did the whole family, do you think they all felt the same?
I don't know. The kids, I guess the future was all an excitement to them, but I know how Elsie and I felt. So we kept on going, and in time we landed in Prince Albert and got a house. And then I had to find a job, and jobs were hard to find. I don't know whether it's because the Depression was coming on then, but it was a case of grab what you could, you know. And
this was 1927.
1927. I remember I got a job hauling sand and gravel for the Northern Cartage with a team of horses and this old stuff, you know. 10 hours a day, 7 in the morning till 6 at night. And I drove Johnny Mitchell's old, wheezing old truck at the box factory and anything at all. And during that summer, I wrote an examination for a job that would be coming up in the customs office here. 26 other hopefuls and we took this exam. And I never heard any more of the result of it until early the next summer. I'd forgotten all about it. I thought I'd had it. And I was with the diamond drilling crew up on the north end of Reindeer Lake, and a plane came over and dropped a sack of mail. And in the mail was a letter from Elsie, and enclosing one from the department. I had got the job. So Elsie suggested that I come right in and not to miss anything. So there was a half-breed lad came down from Brochet then, and he'd been trapping all winter in the barrens, and he sold his fur at Brochet and spent a few days there, a few weeks there. And so I got a ride with him into the Paw and onto Prince Albert. And I get into Prince Albert, and still there's no job. The examination hasn't been, the examination was held, but nothing turned up. So I said, I got to get a job someplace. So I went to the employment office. Sure, there's a job for you down there at the powerhouse. Well, the powerhouse there, you know, they were reinforcing the original foundation, you know, all the way around.
The powerhouse on the river
This
bank?
same old powerhouse. They are reinforcing the foundations. And so I hunt up the foreman, Roddy Grant, and I give him this slip from the employment office. Got a job for you right there, he says that. He said, I'm just going to put a man on it. We've just got one man there, and he's waiting for sidekick. So this is a big old cement mixer, you know. And he said, you know, you got to keep hustling. He said, just the 2 of you there and 4 wheelbarrows taking out the other end. Golly, I found that out. The sand and the gravel and the concrete, you know, to keep these 4 wheelbarrows going. But we kept up with it until one day Roddy comes along and he said, I've got to borrow you a man for about half an hour. Slim, he says, you can make out of it.
Slim.
Slim was right on that job. So that man didn't come back for a full day, and I told Roddy, I said, give me my time, I've had enough of this. Why? And I told him, oh, no. He said, I'll find a couple of guys on that job. He says, you get on down there with that.
You were feeding the 4-wheelbarrow.
2 of us keeping 4 wheelbarrows going in a whirl.
And then you had to do it yourself.
Then I did it myself. Well, a day and a half of that, that's plenty.
What did you get paid for a day?
30 cents an hour, $3 a day.
$3 a day?
7 till 6. Oh, yeah, that was a going rate. So I got my new job. I'm down 8 feet underground alongside the foundation. And there are 2 or 3 other guys down there, and we're shoveling the muck and the mud away, you know, to pouring in new concrete. So I'm down there one day, and I hear, "Dad," and I look up, and there's a couple of boyish faces looking down at me. "Dad, you got the job in the customs. You got to start right away, tomorrow morning." Oh boy, did I ever get out of there. So I'm on hand at customs the next morning, and I got down there. I found they opened up at 9, and I got there at 9, and the collector, the boss, told me what was required, and he said, "Your hours, you know, as you know, you start at 9, and then you go to dinner at 11:30, and you come back at 1, and then we knock off at 4:30.
Boy, that's
Boy, I said, "What is this? Am I in heaven?"
soft
Look,
government job.
You know what happened? I came down at 9, and that 9 o'clock that day I started in, and I barely sat down. I got to go home and eat.
11:30.
Back again at 1. I worked, it seemed to me, only about an hour and a half, and it was time to go home. My conscience really worried me, but you can get along with your conscience, you know, if you got the right bait. Anyway, I stayed in that job for 30 years. I'd never dreamt I'd ever stay at a job for 30 years. And, you know, there's a lot of fun in the job, too. I got one outstanding memory. There was a row over at the counter one time, and I think it was Lloyd Olson was dealing with some guy there, and he was screeching about something. So
Mr. Olson is still...
This is Lloyd Olson.
He's still there.
Now.
He's still there, yes.
Yeah, this is towards the end of my service. And so I walk over, and I said, "What's the trouble?" Well, Lloyd said, "This gentleman doesn't believe in paying duty on a carton of cigarettes." "Oh," I said, "that's it." He said, "It's a gift." So the fellow began to holler again. I said, "Just a minute, let me explain this." I said, "You know," I said, "you may get a $5 gift in at any time. But," I said, "that does not cover spirituous liquor or tobacco in any form." So I said, "Cigarettes or tobacco in any form?" So I said, "It's up to you. You have the option. You can either pay the duty and take them out, or give me the postage and I'll send them back to where they came from." Oh, he screeched some more, and that's more than the cigarettes are worth, and so on. Finally, he backs up and he looks at us, "You know," he says, "the trouble with you white-collar so-and-sos," he says, "you never did a decent day's work in your life." Sir, I had a flashback of the old snowshoe trails in the north, and the homestead and the wood hall, you know, and the old powerhouse. You never did an honest day's work in your life.
Workers.
Well, I didn't say anything to the guy. If I'd said anything at all, it would be too much, you know. But
But things were different then in those days compared to where they are today. You know, there's a lot of... You were lucky to have a job, I guess.
Lucky to have a job. Yeah, very lucky indeed in that kind of a job. And I stayed there 30 years, and then I was pensioned off in 1957. Yeah, that's 21 years ago I've been going on pension. My apologies to the Canadian taxpayer, you know, I should live so long, but that's the way it is, you know. So when I got out of customs, and we had the future all planned for us. We worked it out. We liked the States. We'd traveled there for years all over. And so when I retired, we went down to L.A. and we bought a travel trailer, and we were going to Florida. But we got to Texas someplace, and we thought, well, we'd done a lot of driving. We could do with a little rest. So we pulled down to the Gulf, to Corpus Christi. Beautiful place. Oh, this is fine. We'll stay here a week. Well, we stayed there a month, and we stayed there that winter, and we fell so much in love with the Texans, who really are the kindest and the most courteous people in the world. I don't care whether they're the Anglos or the Spanish Americans. They're just delightful people to live with. So we pulled the trailer down there for 10 years. And then Betty and Vern, they came down to Houston. They moved down there and settled there, and that was only 200 miles away. And
this is your daughter and son-in-law.
Daughter, son-in-law. So it was no trouble to drive 200 miles up there. We didn't need the trailer anymore, so Mama could run up there anytime she wanted to visit the grandchildren. You know? So we sold the trailer and we bought a mobile home.
Can we pick that up? Can we pick that up in just a minute, Harold?
Yes, sure.
Just stand by, please. This is where you're going to put in that... We're talking with Mr. Harold Kemp, and we're talking about the North that I remember, and you probably feel that we've lost our train of thought here because we're in civilization. We're talking about Texas, and we still have a lot to talk about this gentleman because he is quite a man. And you're telling us about Corpus Christi and Texas.
That's right.
We left off there, Harold.
We left there, yes. We disposed of the travel trailer. We didn't need it anymore. We could always go up and see the grandchildren, Betty and Vern, Houston. So we bought a mobile home, mobile home. I'm back in Canada, mobile home. We bought a mobile home. It was a 50-footer. Oh, a beautiful thing, 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, bath. And we had that down there for 3 years, right on the blue waters of the Gulf. And then one August we were up here, and Hurricane Celia blows in at 180 miles an hour. Well, that really tore the town to pieces. And you should see that trailer park. You should see our trailer. All that was left of that was the frame and 6 wheels sticking in the air.
Is that
so?
Right?
But when we got down there, the whole park was cleared off. There wasn't a thing left on it, and they rebuilt the thing. And so we got another mobile home, and identical to the other one. And it's been down there now for 7 years. Mind you, you anchor down there if you want insurance. You're insurance enforced now. We have 5 chains on each side of the trailer bolted to the frame, and they in turn are on augers, 4-foot augers, 6-foot augers screwed right down into the ground. And over the top there are 3 steel bands, and they're anchored down too. So it takes quite a blow to move it. And they've had the odd hurricane blowing there, but nothing like Celia. So when we get back there in the week or so's time, we hope we'll still find it there. Mind you, August, September, and October, they are the hurricane months. Once we get through with them, they don't get tornadoes down there. They're too far south. Yes. Anyway, we've been going down there now every year, and you know, you can't beat that kind of a life. 6 months out here, beautiful Emma Lake, and 6 months in Corpus Christi on the blue waters of the Gulf. You couldn't ask for much more than that, you know.
Well, have you ever been back to the North since you quit?
North? Oh, yes. We kept contact with it for a number of years. I remember in 1935, I think it was, there was a reporter at the Herald here. A reporter and a photographer. They called him Dusty Road. His name was Road, so of course he had to be Dusty. Dusty Road wanted to see the Churchill country. Quite a photographer, and he wanted to take some pictures of the North and so on and so on. So early one September, I said, well, let's go. Okay, let's go. So he and I and Everett, he was then 16 years of age, and I had trailer, boat, and motor. And
that's your son, Everett?
My son, yeah. Mm-hmm. He's grown up now, and at that time, he was 16. No, he was 16 then. And so we go up to Montreal Lake and picked up an Indian, and we went up the lake and down the rapid-filled river, and then we went to Stanley, and oh boy, what a trip. Do you know that it rained every day? Every day it rained. I don't mean to say it poured, but there was a miserable drizzle out of gray, cloudy skies. I don't think we ever got thoroughly dry once, but we got there, and Dusty got all the pictures he wanted, and we came back again. Now, that was in 35. Then we had another trip. That was in, I got a deep-sea chart. I got to keep referring to this, you know. I get out of touch. Oh, yeah. The next one we took, the family went up. The family, well, that is Elsie and I and Everett. He just come in out of 9 years with the mounted police. He was in little past his middle 20s, and Betty had never seen the North, and so she wanted to see it. So the 4 of us take off. Well, it was a little different traveling at that time. We had the car, and they were building the road to L'Orange. And you could drive up within 12 miles of the settlement, and that's where the building was going on. From then on, it was Muskeg. So I knew about when we would get there, so I wrote to the Hudson Bay man at L'Orange, and I asked him if he could arrange to have one of the L'Orange Indian teams come down and meet us, you see, and take us through, which he did. And took us through to L'Orange, and that was fine. And just as we entered the settlement, I saw a chap alongside the road I knew, and I said to the teamster, I said, just stop a minute. So I hopped off and shook hands with this chap. And
Whatchi?
Johannes. So, what are you doing here? Well, I said, we haven't been to Stanley for for the family haven't. I said, for 20 years, and we want to go and take a look at the old haunts. Well, that's fine. I said, the only thing we lack, I said, is a canoe and motor. Oh, we'll fix you up, he said. I got a couple of canoes, and one's a practically new one, he said, and I got a pretty good motor. And he said, take it. Well, I said, how about you? Well, he said, I got one canoe anyway, and I'll only go over to the store so I can paddle across there. He said, that won't hurt me, so take it. So we took it. And we, same old route to the lake and the 4 portages, and we're into Stanley. We hit the Churchill, and we come down the Churchill, past the high Stanley Rock and the old church, and we got around the point, and hey, what's happened? Where's our post? There's no buildings. No store, no warehouse, no dwelling house, no bunkhouse. And then I remembered, of course, the company, the Hudson Bay Company and Revions had amalgamated. And they're all one concern now, and they didn't need 2 posts, so they disposed of one or tore it down, and there it was. So we walked up the hill and to where the house used to be. And all we could find of the house was a hole in the ground grown in with weeds where the cellar used to be.
No kidding.
Boy, we felt like displaced persons, you know. We didn't belong there anymore. Even our house had gone, and we felt kind of nostalgic about all this. Just any young chap came up. Ah, more what she ain't.
What she,
He says, what are you doing up here? Come up to see us? And I said, yeah, we're just up for a holiday. And we went on talking. Finally, Everett, the boy turns to Everett, and he said something to him in Cree, you see, and nice to see you back, or something like that. And Everett looked at him and smiled. Well, he said to me, what's the matter with him? Is he deaf? I said, deaf? No. I said, you can't talk Cree to that guy. He can't talk Cree anymore. Well, he said he talked Cree just as good as any of us when he was a boy here with the rest of us. I said, I know, but that's 20 years out and never using the language, and young, you forget it. So, and Everett turned to me, he said, oh, he says, ask him where Cora Ballantyne is, will you? Cora Ballantyne. Well, when they were both about 9 years old, this was an Indian girl and a really cute-looking little thing. And Everett had a 9-year-old crush on her, you see, and he wondered what had happened to Cora Ballantyne. So I asked the boy, oh, he said, I married her, he says, 4 years ago. He said, we've got a couple of kids. So I translated this back to Everett. I said, you had it, boy. I said, you better start all over again. But anyway, another friend came down, Philip John Charles. Oh, boy, you got to come up and pitch your tent alongside of my house. No, don't bother, we'll send the kids down. So he sent his boys down, they unloaded the canoe and the tent, and they pitched the tent alongside of his house. And that was the beginning of it. We were there, I think, for 8 days, maybe a little longer. And you'll know we were just smothered in visitors. Oh, so glad to see us back again and bring us over fish and stuff. We really, you know, they really overwhelmed us. They'd sit around there and smoking their pipes and drinking gallons of tea, you know, and we were hard pressed to get time enough to take another run down on the Stariac and the falls, you know, but we did. And they would all come around there, and we had quite a time with them.
Can we just stop there for a minute, Harold?
Indeed.
Pick it up in just a minute. We'll be right back with Harold Kemp just a moment from now. I hope you people feel the same as I do. I could sit and listen to this gentleman for hours and hours and hours, which I've done. We're on program 7 here, and we don't know if we're going to end up with 350 of these programs, because we just seem to keep reveling in the past and even getting closer now to almost the present, Harold. We're at Stanley on a visit back. How did Elsie enjoy, your wife Elsie?
Oh,
the chicken, the girl that won't come on television with us.
Yeah,
you know, Elsie the chicken.
Yeah, she should come on, but no. You know, if you ask Elsie, as a lot of people have done, what she thought about her years in the North, she'd say the best years of my life. Yeah, best years of my life. Oh, she enjoyed it. And to get on with this thing, you know, this is a kind of a patchwork. I remember this now. I remember
yes.
That. I'd like to bring in here, when I went into customs, you know, I found that the pay was $100 a month. But by the time they docked your pension off and a few more, well, it got down about $90 a month, you know. So I said, well, the kids and Elsie are going to have any fun with. at all. I got to find some sideline, you see. And, well, it didn't take long to dig up a sideline. In the North, I had tried my hand at writing stories of the North. And after many, many attempts, I must have sent out 20 stories, and they all came back. I finally sold one to an outfit in New York, Fiction House. And I got a letter one time. Dear Mr. Kemp, we liked your story very much. Ricochet, that's what I call it. Enclosed herewith is our check for $40 in payment thereof. Please let us hear from you again. $40 for a story? I said, my golly, I said 15, maybe 20, but 40 bucks. Here were I treading on air after that. I really felt my oats. I said, I'm an author. Boy, I'm going to dip my bucket in that well again. But I was a little too cocky. I tried out with another outfit, you know, and I sent them 32 stories in a row, and they turned them all down, every one of them. And then on the 33rd, I clicked. Well, no, this is it. It wasn't it. 10 or 15 more rejection slips, and again an acceptance. You know, after that, I sold that particular outfit in New York, men's magazines. You know, I sold her 83 stories in a row. It was a woman editor of all things, and she was a Canadian. I sold her 83 stories. And in all, in my writing in the North for these men's magazines, I sold, upwards of 150, I guess, short stories, novelettes, one or two serials, and so on and so on and so on. Then, you know, I had another sideline, and it all came out of the writing. I did a considerable broadcasting on the international and the domestic services of the CBC. Man, there was one more, you mentioned it, introducing this series, Uncle Jim and his Old Timers. Oh, yes. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. That was it.
Everybody remembers Uncle Jim and his old time. This is Uncle
Jim.
Left
and the lady on the left.
Jim, Harold Kemp.
Well, you know all about that. You did plenty of that stuff, didn't you? Boy, oh boy. A dance a week in town, sometimes two. And one dance a month up at Terrace Gardens in Waskesiu, and the country dances. Oh boy. You know the country dances. You get home from work in the afternoon, and you clean up, and you have your supper, and then you get out the car and you drive all over town, and you pick the gang up, and you drive out maybe so to Arborfield, 140 miles away, play a dance, 2 o'clock in the morning, start in again, get back just in time to clean up and go to work.
Yeah, I've done that so many times.
You've done it, you know all about it. Yep. Yeah, that was the...
so you wrote for Pulp magazine?
Pulp magazine.
You
Adventure,
did some broadcast.
Argosy,
yeah.
Black Mask, Blue Book, short stories, Dime Detective, Dime Western.
I remember
Big
all
Book
those.
Western.
Yeah.
You know, one time, I wrote something every night, you know, till all hours of the morning, and when they buy a story, they may hold it, and they hold another one, and they hold another one. And it just happens, I went into Jimmy McConnell's, and here's 5 pulp magazines on there by HSM Kemp, by HSM Kemp, 5.
And
Jimmy
you haven't been paid for them yet?
Oh, I've been paid for them. They probably held them 1 month, 2, 3, 4, and they just happen to all come out at the same time, 5 different magazines with me on the cover. And Jimmy said, hey, boy, you're sure in the chips, aren't you? Well, I said, all those magazines are probably spread over 6 months' work, but I had a lot of fun with that. And
you were telling me, writing for pulp magazines, that you had to be very careful. There was nothing suggestive in it.
No, you couldn't. The old pulp magazines, they were. You had to have a certain literary skill, and the magazines, they didn't want profanity, and they sure didn't take any smut or anything like that. They were action magazines, adventure magazines, all over the world. My specialty, of course, was the North. But they were good magazines, and you pick up a lot of the better magazines today, not better, bigger, and you'll find the names of the old pulp writers. They're still going on.
Is that right, eh? My golly.
And then there was I had another activity. You know, Elsie and I agreed that the Lord had been pretty good to us, you know, and we owed him something in return, and so she started that WA, the Women's Auxiliary, up at Stanley for the women there. When she came to town, she continued it, and she's very active in it. As a matter of fact, she's just as active in it today as she was then, and she has a life membership in it, as a matter of fact. And then she got involved in the Red Cross, and half a dozen of these organizations around town. And for my part, I ran a Bible class for a number of years, and I was on the corporation of the cathedral there for, a good many more. And finally, the time came, I said, I got too many irons in the fire. So we had a business meeting. And you know these meetings, they would get 50 or 60 men together out of the congregation. Boy, they were a power of good. You'd have a supper prepared by the ladies, 50 cents a supper, and then you'd have your business meeting outlining the coming activities of the church, and then a speaker, and then they'd have the layman's hymn and the benediction, and that was it. Well, I got too many irons in the fire. So I told them I wanted somebody to take my president's job. So they said, all right. So they had a meeting there, an election of officers, and the mantle of Elijah descended on Elisha. But his name wasn't Elisha, it was J.J. Sennon. You may have remembered that, J.J. Sennon. He was the second president in that outfit. I don't mind telling the guy. So, you made a good job of it, a very, very good job. Probably a better job than I did, too.
Well, I doubt that very much, but I remember that's quite a way back. That's a long way back.
Oh, that's a long way back. That's a long way back.
Look, we'll have to come back to Harold Kemp on our next program. So I hope you've enjoyed this program so far, but we're getting into almost the present day, up to the present day. I want to go back to some of that Uncle Jim history. I want to go back. We didn't even talk about the book you wrote, The Northern Trader. I want to go back to, so many other things that you've done in our community, the pulp magazines again. But we certainly hope you're enjoying this series. It's Reminiscing with Harold Kemp, and it's called The North I Remember. And it's a series that we've been hoping to do for many, many years, and at last it's come to reality. So we'll see you again at our next program with Harold Kemp. Thank you very much for watching today. I guess we can't go on forever and ever because Harold wants to leave for Texas. And this will be our last program. And I thought that perhaps I'd just review that we've been talking with Mr. Harold Kemp, who is a ripe young age of 86. He stands as straight as a rimrod. He has a memory like a steel clamp. He has a vision of even the future of the North, I think, because that's one of the last questions I'm going to ask you. But we'd like to reflect back to one particular issue you never even touched on. You wrote a lot of pulp stories, Harold, but you didn't tell us about the book, the hardcover book you wrote called The Northern Trader.
Northern Trader, yeah.
And this book is in every library.
Every library I've been in, the States and Canada never was, but it's out of print. I don't know.
Tell us about what prompted you to write a book.
Well, I tell you, you see, I've done a lot of work for the CBC and Tales of the North and so, and a lot of people said, why don't you put it in a book form? So finally I broke down, and I took 6 weeks off. And I didn't take 6 weeks off. In the evenings, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I pounded out the story of my misspent life, my autobiography. It didn't take long, 6 weeks, and I had the thing done, put it in the mail. It was accepted. And that concluded my writing. And I meet people all the time. Now you're retired, you're doing a lot of writing. I tell them I haven't got time. I have no time for writing. No,
Is that right?
Yes, no time. But this is an odd thing about that book. It comes on that trip when I was with the family at Stanley. A young chap there, married man, a man around about 30, came to me and he said, I wonder would your wife and you come down to the house? And I said, yes. He said, I'd like her to look at my little boy. So we went down there, and it was across the river. And he was a little fellow on the bed, holding his face and moaning and groaning. So I said to George Mackenzie, I said, what's with the boy? Well, he said he developed an earache last night and he hasn't slept. He said, and I thought your wife, he said, she's quite a musketeer squaw. She's a real medicine woman that she might be able to help him. Okay, medicine woman, I said, do your stuff. So she checked the boy over and she said, go up to the Hudson Bay Company, see if they got any olive oil. So I went up there, and some cotton wool, she said. So I went up there, and there was a new man there, but he had a white wife, and he said, sure, they got olive oil. They used it. His wife used it in cooking. Here, take the bottle. Bring back what you don't want, and cotton wool, sure. So I went back, and Elsie heats this, or warms this olive oil in a spoon and poured it in, put in the cotton wool, tied a towel around his face, and he lay down after a while, and by golly, he dropped right to sleep. George's wife, Mama Scotch, is she ever a medicine woman? Why did you leave us? Well, you know, years afterwards, 10 or maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I was driving out from Prince Albert, going home. And there's an Indian walking along the road, a young chap there. And he didn't thumb me or anything. He just turned his head and looked at me as much as say, I could sure use a ride. So I stopped him. And he ran up and he got in the car. And I said, where are you going? He says, Tweedsmuir. So I said, oh, you live there? Well, he says, yes. He said, I'm building a new house. He said, I've been out on a survey gang. He says, oh, spring and summer. And they got a little money, and I want to do some more on the house. So I looked at him, and golly, I said, I know this guy. And I couldn't think who he was. So I said, what's your name? And he said, George Mackenzie. Well, of course, George Mackenzie. I said, do you remember Stanley and the old trips we used to make and the dances we used to have? And he looked at me blank, and I thought, what am I talking about? I'm talking about 40 years ago, before this guy was born. So I said, well, who's a George Mackenzie? Stanley. He said, I guess it's my dad. He said he gave me his name. We're both George Mackenzie. Why? I said, of course. I said, I'd have known you in 1,000. I never saw father and son look so much alike.
Is that right, eh?
So then he says to me, he says, what's your name? So I said, told him. Oh, he said, I know you now. He said, you wrote a book, didn't you, Northern Trader? I said, yes. He says, I got it in the house. He said, I've read it 2 or 3 times. I got quite a bang out of that. I said, you did? He said, especially that part where you tell about coming down to Dad's house, he said, to fix up one of the kids that got an earache. And your wife fixed her up so good. He said, well, he says, I was that kid. He says, well, what a coincidence. If I hadn't picked him up, I'd have missed one of the coincidences of my life.
Yeah.
But
back to that Northern Trader, you were telling me that the publishers, or you felt after, that you put too much into the book. You could
well, no, they didn't. That's what sold the book, I guess. The old pulp magazines, it was go, you see. They didn't care for speckled sunsets or anything else. They wanted action, you see. So you go ahead and you tell in 10 words what you wanted to say in 20, compress it, and then when you get to the end of the story, cut it off short about the time they wanted more. And that's the way I wrote the book. So one of the reviewers reviewing this book, I don't know whether the States or God, he said, Kemp made just one mistake, he says, in this book of his. He said, he got enough material in here for 3. Well, I couldn't go back and plow a dead fire, so that was that. So this was this George Mackenzie. I have a note here. He was one of those that, while we were at Stanley, they took us down to see this kid with the earache. And one night there, Philip John and I are sitting over a low fire we have, and we were talking. Betty, one of Philip John's boys, a kid about 17, he took her off to a square dance, took Betty to a square dance.
That's your daughter, Betty?
That's the daddy. Yeah, about the same age, and there was this hoedown going on in one of the houses. And Everett had the canoonies across the river, and Elsie was visiting in the house. And golly, this is a good time to bring this in. Now, as I mentioned before about their visiting them in their houses. You know, you hear a lot of criticism about the Indian. He's not a very good worker, and he's not too clean and all the rest of it. And I don't like to hear that. I'm talking about the Northern Indian, you know. I've seen it so often. You put a white man living the Indian life with the same handicaps and under the same conditions as the Indian have, that white man doesn't show up very good in comparison to the Indian. Now, I've said before, and it may interest your viewers, they have the question in their mind, as I said before, I've slept in their houses and their teepees. I've used their blankets and slept on their bunks and everything else, and traveling in the wintertime there, and cold nights, whoever I happen to be traveling with, we double up together for warmth, and I've never been lousy. As a matter of fact, I don't know what a louse looks like. Oh, you could get lousy, you know, in the old lumber camps. The old timers used to tell the greenhorns when they came in, said, be sure to put your gloves on tonight when you go to bed. And The guy said, what for? Well, he says, you know, we're pretty lousy here. If you don't wear gloves, you have to gut yourself. And you could get a good crop of lice in the old threshing country. In the north, no, sir.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Isn't that an interesting
So
observation?
anyway, Elsie was visiting in the house, and old Thomas Cook came along and sat down. Old Thomas Cook, the old preacher there, and we began talking about this and that, our misfortunes and our good fortunes, and then he turned to me and he says, you know, it's not like long ago. So I said, what way do you mean? He says, you remember my boy Colin that your wife nursed back to health when he thought he was going to die? And I said, yeah. Well, he said, Elgo no more those parts. Elgo, he says, Elgo no more the cabbage match you. He says, that one doesn't live anymore.
Is that right?
So I says, that's so? And he says, you remember Charlie? Charlie was the Devil McCare boy that ran the bad side of the altar, the Stanley Rapid that pretty near claimed the lives of Betty and Everett that time. He ran that rapid when no one else would run it in an 18-foot freighter, and he tried it again in 17, and he dumped, but he managed to get to shore. Sure, I knew Charlie. Now, we still know those not so. He says, he too's not living. Well, I said, what is the matter? Well, he says, they got sick, and nobody looks after us anymore. He says, nobody cares for us. And while we were there a day or so before, we heard the church bell toll, and here was a little procession going into the churchyard carrying a little white coffin. They told me the little girl had died at 6 months old, and they were burying her. And I thought to myself, Charlie Cook, Colin Cook, this little girl, while we're here, 72 births while we were there in the 5 years, and 2 deaths. Elsie looked after them. We had 72 births and only 2 unavoidable deaths. And here, 3 instances right there. Yeah, says Thomas Moy Tapskuchkaya. It's not like long ago. They don't care for us anymore.
Let's come back to that in just a moment. Stand by as we go back to the North Country that Harold Kemp remembers in just a moment.
Boy,
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. This is a series that sort of has been unplanned from the angle that we don't know how long we're going to go. We do know that we have Mr. Harold Kemp here, who has a background of living in the North, working in our area of Prince Albert, and doing so many things in this part of the country since the year 1907 until right now, for that matter. So we welcome back Harold Kemp for another chinwag here on the North I Used to Know. And on our last program, Harold, we were talking about the so much sadness that you left in Laurens that year when the
epidemic
the Italian flu went through, and
a year after the flu hit
Prince Albert,
hit Prince Albert and district.
No.
But before we come to that, Jack, I have a confession to make, you know.
Yes?
The wife, Elsie, and I were talking this thing over, and she says, you know, you're all wet in one detail. I said, what's that? She said, when we got married back in 1916, she said, the government didn't give me $45 a month and you 15. They only gave me 30. So I didn't get 60 a month. I only got 45 and you, she said. So some old swat's going to get to watching this and say, here, what kind of a four-flusher is this guy? And they'll pile on. So I want that corrected. It was, she got 45 a month. Had I been knocked off, I think she'd have got 60, but that's the way they think.
I see, okay.
And,
by the way, while we're on Mrs. Kemp, Mrs. Elsie Kemp, that we were hoping she'd come down and maybe appear on one of these programs, and we did everything, but we went on our knees even. We begged, because I think the wife does play such a major part.
She did a very great part, and she's still, oh, she's a wonderful woman, very, very active. You'd think she's about 60 instead of 80. But I couldn't get her to come down anyway. She said, well, one talker in the family's enough, and you're pretty good at that.
She said one gabber in the family. One gabber.
I think that was the word she used. And Jack, there's another point. This thing here that I hold in my lily white hand, it's not a shopping list. It's a, you know, you could get some old guy talking about the old time and everything, and he'll mumble away in his beard and go on and on and on and bore you to death. And in this series, I'd start that and we'd end up at Christmas, you see. I got to be in Texas pretty soon. So I compile a sort of a deep-sea chart to keep me on course, and I'll refer to that.
Well, that's fine.
Just so that we don't
Well,
get
I
too
have
far
my
from the
notes
subject.
too, and I want to pick it up where we finished La Ronge in that sad winter, and we come spring, and you sort of felt that homesteading was a dumb game.
Oh, it was a dumb game. So then we went to Wheeler Cross, didn't we?
Yes.
Yeah, we went to Red Earth after that. And then we were heading for Stanley after I got that big fur haul down in Red Earth, and they transferred me to Stanley.
Réveillon?
Réveillon Frères, R-E-V-I-L-L-O-N.
Yes.
Some of them called it Réveillon, but it's Réveillon Frères. Yeah, I was working for Réveillons. And so we landed in La Ronge there, and Allegheny gave us provided transportation for us, and we took off for Stanley. Now,
Stanley Mission.
Stanley Mission.
Very famous place.
Stanley Mission was named the first missionary to go in there, the Reverend Robert Hunt. Apparently he came from a very well-to-do family in Britain, and he named Stanley after their ancestral home there, Stanley Park. I think it's in Lincolnshire. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's where the name Stanley came from. And to get there, you go 30 miles up Lac La Ronge, and then you got 4 portages, and you got 3 intervening lakes, and you come out on the Churchill, and then you come downstream, and you pass this is just in passing. As you go approaching Stanley, practically right at Stanley, there's a huge outcrop of rock. It's about 100 feet high, and there's vegetation grows on it. But in the old days, when the Indians came down there, they passing by for their first trip, they'd take them, they'd shoot an arrow up there, and if the arrow fell on top of the rock, they'd have good luck. If it didn't make it and it fell back in the water, they could anticipate bad luck. So they call the place the uphill shooting place. Umachiwis-Munich. That's Stanley.
What's that again?
Umachiwis-Munich. That's uphill shooting place, you see.
Is that right?
So we came down to Churchill, and we passed the big rock, and we get around the corner, and here's that beautiful old church standing on the point, I guess the oldest church in Saskatchewan. And just beyond that was the Réveillon post, and on the south shore was the Hudson's Bay post. And the population of the place was pretty well split between both sides of the river. And the post at Stanley, well, a very, very comfortable and well-furnished house, square logs, whitewashed, and a bunkhouse up on the hill. And then down the hill on towards the river, there was another big whitewashed building, the store and a warehouse and everything else. And that's where that was to be our home there for about another 5 years.
You're working for who?
Réveillon Frères, the French company.
For the French company.
They afterwards amalgamated with the Hudson Bay Company, and so they're out of existence.
So Stanley was a 5-year spell for you. That's probably the longest place you had stayed.
That's right.
Since you started working at the age of 16.
I kicked all around, but married then, and it was a good job and a good post, and it was a good company to work for. You worked for Réveillons, you ran the post. You didn't have an inspector breathing down your neck all the time, or a flock of letters coming in telling you what to do. And it was isolated, if you can use the word isolated. I mean, nobody much went to Stanley because there's nothing to go for. It was the end of the road. And then the Churchill River, well, no one traveled up and down the river for the same reason. And I guess all the years we were there, we saw maybe half a dozen government men, a fire ranger, the odd game guardian coming through and making a survey. We had, pardon me, we had a census one year, we had an election one year, electoral officer came in, but to all intents and purposes, we were out beyond the mainstream, you see.
You lived with the Indian people in the area?
I lived right there.
What was the population, the numbers?
Well, I should imagine around about 250, 300 people there.
And how many white people were there?
One, beside ourselves, the Hudson Bay man on the south shore, running the Hudson's Bay Company, and he was married to an Indian girl, but he had his side and we had our side. A good deal of rivalry between us, but a good friendship too. And the very fact, you know, that the place was isolated, the Indians were out of contact with the demoralizing, if I may use that word, and I'll use the demoralizing effect of the white man, you see. They had been Christianized years and years before by this Reverend Robert Hunt, and they led their own life. In fact, the place was so much off the beaten path, we didn't even have a mail service in there.
Is that right?
Yeah, there was a mail came through once a month to La Ronge, and it was a 6-week deal. It'd break up and freeze up in the fall and the spring. And if you wanted the mail, well, it was a 100-mile round trip to go get it, you see. So once a month we'd go down to the mail. Once Elsie went down with me in the wintertime, driving her own string of dogs, and once she went down with me again in the summer. But we settled so well among those very, very fine people, reputed to be the finest Indians in the north, and they are. And we went away from there. We were glad to get back again. Elsie went down to the L'Orange a couple of times, but she was glad to get back home again. And as a matter of fact, all the time we were standing, a little better than 5 years, we only came out to civilization, as you like to call it, twice. We'd stayed there 2
I'd like you
years
to reflect back on, you say the Indians of Stanley Mission were the finest people in the world.
There are lots more like them, I suppose, out in civilization, but in the north, the Indians were the finest people in the north. For instance, they're very religious people. They've been Christianized a long time, and they carried the religion into their lives. They wouldn't hunt or trap on Sunday. We had a parson would come in there for a month or two in the summer, but they held services in the church regularly. One or two of the older men there, they appointed them as the local preachers, you know, and so it was. They would, when the church bell rang, you'd see them coming across the river and streaming in, and the church and their religion meant a great deal to them.
I'm going to leave that just for a moment here,
Yeah.
so we'll come back to that. We'll just take a break for a commercial here. Back again and talking with Mr. Harold Kemp and the North I Once Knew. We're at Stanley Mission, and you're working for Revion. I hope I have
Revion.
that. Revion. You're in the fur business.
London, Paris, and New York. They had posts all through the country.
Did you have to do some trapping yourself, or did you?
Well, yes. At Stanley, we did a lot of it. You see, Stanley was unique in another way. By the first week or the second week in September, there wasn't a native lift in the place. They'd pitch off, as they called it, pitching off and pitching in. They'd pitch off to their winter camps. Some of these, their winter homes, and they might only be half a day away, and others would be away up on the Waterman River 5 days north, you know. Mm-hmm. And when they cleared out, well, the place was deserted. Revions were very good concerning staff. They gave me, told me to hire a storeman and a kind of a partner for me in the deal, and I got a hold of a young fellow. He's still living at L'Orange. Malachi McLeod, Mooney-ass they called him, because he had gray eyes. He looked like a white man. Mooney-ass McLeod. And
could we just explain that that's what a white man is, for those people who don't realize that?
Well, Mooney-ass, that's a corruption of a Montrealer, you see. He came from Montreal. They couldn't say Montreal, they'd say Mooney-ow, you see. And Mooney-ass, Malachi, I had him there. He was a storeman, and he traveled with me. And his sister, Elsie, got to work in the house, Betsy. So by September, there was no one left in the place. You couldn't travel the country. There wasn't no good traveling. Trapping hadn't started yet. So we sent Betsy and Roderick over to L'Orange for a visit with their folks. They were living on L'Orange. And then came the end of September, and we took the canoe, and we had a teepee and a tent, and threw it in there with the kids and the dogs, and we took off down the river. And
the whole Kemp family?
Yeah, the whole outfit. We'd trap rats down there, muskrat down there, mink for a couple of weeks. And then when that trapping was done, we came back up to the post, and great countries for foxes. And Elsie and I used to trap these foxes up and down the river there. And the young foxes, they weren't wise yet, you know. And we'd catch them in a little #1 fox trap, just hold them with the toes, you know.
Yeah.
And we went up and saw the traps pretty regularly, and take them out and penned them up, fed them a fish, you know, until about the middle of November, and their skins were getting pretty prime then, and then, well, from then on it was bye-bye blackbird, as poor little Foxy was concerned anyway. But, you know, in two years trapping, and with the wages that I earned, and so on, and no expenses, the mess account was provided for, you had a furnished house, and you might send out for the odd item, but upshot was, in the end of 2 years there, we began to build up a little stake, and we paid off that $1,000 loan, something we would never have done in 20 years if we'd stayed on the homestead.
Is that right?
Yeah. So That life, of course, Jack, isn't for every woman. A lot of women, I can understand them. They like society of their own kind and be marooned up there, you know.
Well, you're really out of civilization.
You're out of civilization. You're in a civilization.
What about radio? Did you have any radios?
Well,
up
we
there?
did. An inspector came in there in the middle of the 20s, and he's speaking about this wonderful invention, this radio that we heard about. So he said, you should have one. You know, you get in touch with the outside. So we ordered a radio. It was a one peanut tube. They had peanut tubes in that side, a little bit of a one tube, you know.
Yeah.
And they couldn't answer in the tuner, and that's about all. And they finally, after about 6 weeks, this radio came in. I guess it was a box about that big. But behind the house and up on the hill, I was in preparation of this. I'd put up a couple of great painted aerial masts, you know, slightly smaller than the one out here at the transmitter, but still. And the antenna and the lead-in. So when the time came, well, we just hooked onto our little radio set there, you know, and plugged in the A and the B and the C batteries and so on. And I had a couple of headphones come in with it, and I plugged the headphones in, gave Elsie one, and I had one. And then, well, let's find out what it's all about. So I start turning and squealing and howling and crackling, and all of a sudden, I get a woman's voice. She's giving a recipe on how to make a cake. Well, I wasn't interested in cake. I wanted to hear some music. She wanted to sound like. I put out my hand to tune this thing out, and Elsie grabbed me. Don't, she said. And her eyes were almost shining. She said, you know, that's the first white woman's voice I've heard in nearly 2 years. That suddenly hit me.
Yeah.
Well, she could have gone to Orange, as I say, but she liked the life, and another thing about it, when we got to Stanley, she took a look through the store and so on, and she said to me, you know, we're in a frightful situation here. I said, well, she said, we're 7 days north of civilization, 7 days away from the nearest doctor, 7 days of travel.
7 days of travel?
Well, it took us 7 days to go in there, you see.
Golly.
You go in there now, you drive to Orange in 2 or 3 hours and fly in from there. But anyway, she said, and there are no drugs in the place. What happens in case of sickness? What happens to our kids? And what about the people in the village? No, I don't know. So soon after that, the Indian department, the Indian agent came up, and they also spelled her worries to him. Well, he said, look, I'll tell you what you do. You make up a list of Indian department drugs and order what you want. He said, I'll see you get them. So she made up her list. And she was always a kind of a nut for health and that, the other. And so among her orders, among the orders she sent, it was for 1,000 Dover tablets. They were wonderful for colds and warding off incipient pneumonia and this. And so these
Dover tablets.
Dover
Never
tablets.
heard of them.
Dover tablets. No, maybe you don't nowadays. They got other antibiotics. But, and a couple of gallons of cod liver oil, fish oil, our boys used to call it, and every kind of drug, you know, agarol for the eyes, and so on and so on. And she polished up on this stuff. Well, any Indian got sick there, she told them, you come on up to the house and I'll give you some drugs, I'll fix you up. If you get sick there, well, I'll go down and see you. And if you're out in your camps and handy and you get sick, come on in. She said, we'll open up one of these houses and I'll look after you. And she would allot them a certain amount of drugs to carry away with them. He'd give them a handful of these Dover tablets, you see. Well, I guess by her looking after them that way and taking a little interest in the people, in the 5 years there we were there, we had 72 births and we only had 2 deaths. And those 2 deaths were unavoidable. They'd have died anyway. We couldn't do anything about it. Years afterwards, we came out to town, and one of the kids got sick, and Elsie said, oh, if you were uptown, she said, get about a dozen Dover tablets, will you? And I said, sure. So I go into Mitchell's drugstore, and I said, give me a dozen Dover tablets, will you? And he said, yes. He said, where's your prescription? I said, prescription? I said, I haven't got a prescription. What do I want a prescription for? What? She said, he said, this is a narcotic. Dangerous narcotic. You can't get that without a doctor's prescription. And I said, well, for heaven's sake, we've been dishing them up with a handful. I said, the people in the north. And I said, none of them died. I said, there's only 2 died, and they didn't die from eating Dover tablets. So I had to go and pay for a prescription. I should have brought a handful out with me when I came, I guess. Anyway.
But your wife was sort of the community doctor.
She was. She was the
medical
people
center.
Looked after them. There was one girl, I don't know, she had a fever. And Elsie said, I don't know that girl's going to die. I know she's going to die. Well, I said, what can you do? She said, I got to break up that fever. And she started giving her aspirin. Increasing it. Oh, my golly, she was giving that girl 50 grains a day, and all of a sudden the fever broke. And the girl lay in a bed of perspiration, but she got better. So I guess you got to take a chance anyway, you know. Anyway, she had wonderful success with it. And then, as I said before, these Indians were very, very religious. And that old church there, the first day we went there, we were kind of surprised to find that the men sit on one side and the women sit on the other side. Right? Yeah, on each side of the aisle. And old Thomas Cook, he was a fine old Christian gentleman. He was the preacher, and he led the service, and he led the singing. And afterwards, when we came out else, he said to me, he said, "You see that organ sitting up there in the front in the corner?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I guess it doesn't work." Oh, I said, "I don't know." So Thomas came out then, and I said, "I see you got an organ." And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Why don't you use it?" He said, "There's no one to play it." So I looked at Elsie, and I got a look, and I said, "My wife plays." I said, "She'd be glad to play the organ for the services." "No," says him. He says, "My grandchild, will you do that?" "Oh, we will be so happy." So after that, there, Elsie played the organ for the services all through the time we were there, and she organized the WA and the Women's Auxiliary, and then with this looking after, the old ladies all bawled when she left, and I don't wonder, we put a ball to ourselves.
We'll come back to that, and that's a very important point. We'll come back to that, about leaving Stanley and how you felt about Stanley in just a moment. Back again, and we're strictly off the cuff, and we're imposing upon Mr. Harold Kemp to reflect back to the early days of our North Country, the North I once knew, and we left you at the Stanley Church.
In the church.
The church,
That's a good place to leave you.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to tell you something about that old church. I suppose practically, I was going to say everybody.
The most famous.
Most people have heard of Stanley Church, and they may not have heard the real story of it. When I was coming out from Tunbridge Wells in Kent to join my father out here, we had been attending a Holy Trinity Church in the city there, and the Sunday before I left, the parson, the Reverend David Stather Hunt, he came to me and he said, "I understand," he said, "you're going to Canada," he said, "to join your father." I said, "Yes, in Saskatchewan." I said, "That's the diocese." I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You'll be probably going to Prince Albert." I said, "Probably." Well, he said, it's not likely, but there's a possibility that in some future date you might travel north of Stanley, long way up to the Churchill River, and leave Prince Albert and go up there to that north country on the Churchill River to a place called Stanley Mission. And he said, when you get there, you'll see a church standing there. Now, he said, "I'd like you to take a good look at that church and write me and tell me how it's standing." He said, "Because my father built that church."
Is that right?
Yeah. He said he and a half-breed carpenter from L'Orange, a man named Sanderson, and Indian volunteer labor, they built that church. Well, when we got up there, we looked at this church, and I thought what he said. He said, "You know, when we built that church," he said, our family were all there, and before he started on the church, he said, before he built a house, and the whole family, we lived in a couple of teepees, like the Indians. And I thought, well, here's a semi-wealthy family from England coming out there and devoting their lives. Anyway, he said, and then then the building of the church started, and it happened, he said, that one of my other brothers working on this church, he was up on a scaffold and he fell off and he broke his leg. And he said, "I was born at Stanley." Oh, and then he goes on and described this church. They could have been just a square box, you know. But oh no, it was built up, came up like this, then a hip roof came in, then it went up again and another hip roof, and then there was the tower in 4 sections, gradually diminishing. On top of the tower there were Gothic arches, and on top of that a long, slender steeple with a weather vane on the top. It was beautiful. And when we were there, colored glass windows, and Mr. Hunt said, you know, he said, the only thing that came from outside for that church, he said, were the hinges, the door locks And that was all, and the glass for the windows. He said every board in that place, he said, was whipsawn by hand, every board.
Heaven's sake.
And he said, done by the Indians themselves in voluntary labor. And so we went in the church, and the inside of the church, there was nothing slipshod or let's get the job done. It was beautifully finished inside, ornamentally even, you know. And we looked at this church, you know, and you could stand in that church and the sun would come in through those colored windows and you'd look around and you'd almost imagine you were in a country church in England, you know. And that was his plan and his design. Well, that was fine. We wrote and told him about this famous old church. And incidentally, on the wall of that church there's a brass plate. I think it's to the memory of, I think the name is Maria Trivett, age 24. After Hunt left there, Trivett came in, the Reverend Mr. Trivett, and he must have been a considerably younger man because he brought his wife in there from England down the Churchill and so on. And she died in childbirth there at the age of 24, you know, pitiful.
Yes.
Far from her home, you know. And before she died, she realized, I guess, the end was coming, and she said, you know, I don't want to be buried in the churchyard. She said, you know, the roving huskies will dig up my bones, and I dread that. I want to be buried inside the church. So they took up a part of some of the boards in the chancel, and they buried her there, and there's a plate on the wall to her memory. So much for the church as it was then. Well, we came out for a trip to town, and we came back again, and that's one of our trips in, one of our 2 trips in, and we came around the big rock, and what's happened to the church? We thought a tornado had struck it. All the upper works had gone, the steeple under the Gothic arches, and here was this stark-looking thing like the prairie churches. You see 4 square walls and the...
What happened?
What happened? Yeah, a good question. We asked the Indians, hey, what happened to the church? The bishop did it.
The bishop?
The bishop did it. I said, what for? Well, he said he looked at the church and he said the tower was leaning and it was a menace. And menace was right on a point overlooking the river. And he said it had to come down.
Okay.
So he said the Indians, they're always a little scared of authority and they didn't like to argue with the old boys. So he put them to work and they sawed all the thing all off and they put a rope on it. All the men in the village started to haul the beautiful upper works down. But they couldn't get it down, so they had to investigate. And then they found that Hunt was a little bit wrong. Something else came out from England. There were 4 angle iron braces at each corner, and they were nailed in there, and they had to knock these and pry these braces up before they could get the upper works down. So,
God.
the Indians there, they were up in arms about it. And I said, well, why did you say something about it? No, the Kichiyami-Egamo, you know, the big shot, the bishop. I said, so I said, we'll have something to say about it next time he comes around. So he didn't come around for a couple of years. And then he
showed up,
confirmed those that were there who had the instruction. And then he had a preliminary meeting in the church and welcoming committee for him and a welcoming congregation. And then the next day there would be, that day later on, there'd be a meeting for the men of the parish with him and the schoolhouse. They occasionally use the building, they call it a schoolhouse. And there was a rather funny thing happened there, Jack, if I may digress for a minute. The old bishop, he was an old martinet, you know. He should have been a colonel in the army. And he brought an interpreter up with him, the Reverend Canon Fraser from the Pa, who spoke Cree eloquently. And so the bishop sits here and his wife alongside him in the chancel of the church, and they had a hymn and a prayer, and then Fraser got the nod from his nibs, and Fraser gets up and he said, now, he said, the bishop is with us, and I know, he said, that you have things to say to him, and perhaps you'd like to welcome him. And old Mary Charles, a big stout old lady, she gets up, yes, I have something to say. I want to talk about this steeple, she said. He came up here and he tore it down. We were born in the shadow of that steeple, and he can get up there and put it back up again.
To the
Well, I looked at Fraser and I thought, hey, here's going to be a real tornado. So Fraser said, this is Mrs. Charles, and she said that how glad the people are all here to see you, that God in His wisdom has allowed you to come, and He hopes that your stay here will be very enjoyable, that God in His mercy will allow you to come back again, pointing up at the ruined steeple, you know. So, yes. So I saw Fraser afterwards, and I said, I heard some translating, interpreting. I said, I never heard anything like it. I said, you don't let your right hand know what your left hand do. He said, I think one of a row. He said, you know what would have happened, so that was it. So the next day we have this meeting in the schoolhouse, and the men all sat there like a bunch of sheep. Well, I said, say something. You want to talk to them about the church, don't you? Well, I said, go ahead and talk. So one or two of them said some little thing, and finally I took over. And I said,
we're going to have to leave right now until our next program. We'll take over at the steeple. Our time is up for this session. Again, a thanks to Harold Kemp and his reminiscences of the North that he remembers. We'll be back again with our next chapter. Thanks for listening. For 4 weeks now, we've had the opportunity, and I call it a real opportunity, to get into our studios here at CKBI Television, Mr. Harold Kemp, who spent his early days in the North Country and his entire life, right from 1907 on. He was, I guess, 15 or 16 when he came from England to this part of the country. And he lived in the North Country and in Prince Albert. We're not at that stage. We're still in the North. And I just might, before we get back to Harold today, just might mention that it's always been our hope at CKBI to get people like Mr. Kemp in our studios. And there are others out there who perhaps you know, who perhaps you might suggest to us we might continue on this type of talking and this type of series in reminiscing about the early days, the pioneer days of our part of the country. So if you do know of someone like that who feel that they can express themselves, who can come into our studios here, please let us know. We'd like to pick it up from there. We're not quite finished with Mr. Kemp. We'd probably go on for another 10 half hours. We left him last program when he was confronting the bishop of the Diocese of Saskatchewan in Stanley Mission, and you're saying that you're meeting in this thing and you're asking the local people to say something, and they wouldn't.
We had the meeting in the church, and that was very decorous, of course. And then in the afternoon there, the activists were transferred over to the school, and we were a little more free there. So the bishop, he takes his seat in the front with the Canon Fraser's interpreter and so on. And the canon said, now, he said, we understand, he said, that you want to discuss several items with the bishop, and he has graciously permitted himself to come over and meet you. Now, what is the first thing you have on your mind? So I looked at these Indians, and they sat there, you know.
They wouldn't say anything.
I bumps on a log. I said, well, say something. You want to talk? Well, you know, they say, as I say again, they don't like the buck authority. So finally one of them muttered something. Well, he said, it's about the church. So the bishop was sitting there expectantly. So I said, well, the main point is it's about the church. Well, he said, what about the church? I said, the steeple. And I could just feel the old boy bristling out.
Turn
the
red.
Old hero of the Battle of Cut Knife he was, you know. He was an old fighting parson. And he said, what about the steeple? Well, I said, you know, to use their own words, these Indians here say, they born under the shadow of the steeple of the old Holy Trinity Church. And with it gone, it seemed part of their lives have gone. So they want your permission to go to work and put another steeple up. It can never replace the steeple and the Gothic arches and so on, but at least it'll give a finish to the place. Well, I could feel his ire rising. He had a church up there now with battlements and a tower like the dozens of churches he built all over the prairies. Ugly-looking monstrosities. Plain box, a plain tower. And he said, well, he said, we have no money, he said, for building steeples. So I turned to the Indians and I said, you hear what he says? He said he has no money for building steeples. Huh, well, we don't need money. So I said, no, my lord, we don't need money. He said, your man down at the Larange, the Reverend Charlie Hives, he has a sawmill there, and he's lots of lumber, and he said, give us all the lumber we want. Well, he said, that's all right. He said, but I'm not sending carpenters in to build a steeple. I said, we don't need carpenters. I said, this whole church was built by native labor, whipsawn. Well, I said, all we need is your permission. So he hedged and he snorted and he breathed fire. And I said, well, look, in essence, boil down this is it. May we put the steeple up or may we not? If you want, well, we'll let it go down in history that you refused to have the steeple put on the church to conform somewhat with the old church. Oh, well, it's all, well, if you can do it, he says, go ahead. Is that all you want? That's all we want. Out he goes. Fine. So we sent a few canoes to Laurens, and they got the lumber up, and we went to work, and we put this steeple on as it appears today. And anyway, sometime after that, the Venerable Archdeacon, the Venerable and very much venerated Archdeacon Paul, he'd come up there for a month or two in the summer, and he was afterwards a baronet, succeeding his dad to the baronetcy in Ireland. And he took no salary for all his work, and he spent his money lavishly on the church and on the people. And he had the whole church restored, renovated, painted inside, new roof put on, everything. And the upshot is that I think it probably will add a coat of paint since, but the church you see there today is as it originally stood, except it hasn't got that towering steeple.
You took a picture of that, the
I
first
did.
church in 1911, and we gave it to George Slingsby of our photography department, and he's making a slide of it. We hope to show it before we finish this series.
So many people have seen it.
Yes.
You know.
The Stanley Mission Church
That's
is,
right.
is something that the Travel Bureau of Saskatchewan uses as
right.
a scenic point.
Yeah, in the new
church,
form, but not in the old.
The new form, not the old form.
I'm going to take that thing, I'm going to print another enlargement on, and I'm going to frame it, and I'm going to send it up to put up in the church, and I'm going to take, in my book, A Northern Trader, I give the story that Stay There Hunt told us about the building of the church, and I'm going to put that in another frame and give the two so that coming generations can see what the church was and how it was built. That's for the record. It should be done, yeah. There's one little thing that that I remember coming in on that trip when we saw our ruined church. We'd been out with the fur again. I had Jonas and Norman in the fur canoe, and I had Malachi, Munias, and I in our own canoe with the wife and the kids and our stuff. And we stayed in town there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we came back, and the boys visited at Lacorn and so on, and so we were ready to come back. And we loaded up and came up Montreal Lake and down the Montreal River to Montreal Portage. Now, that's not the Montreal Portage, the freight road. This is the river portage. Yeah. The river takes a big, long swing around, and the portage cuts directly across. It's the length of the portage depends on who you're talking to. Some say 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. I would judge the portage is about 3.5 miles. And we hit the head of this portage about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 o'clock maybe. And the sun was westering. It was getting along towards fall. And we put the Elsie and the kids, and we were taking in a Scotch apprentice clerk with us. We put them ashore to walk over this 3-mile portage. And we would take young Dennis. He was, I think he was then about 2 years old. And we'd take him in the canoe. So they went over the portage, we start down the river. And we didn't realize how low the river was. We had bumping on the rocks and some of the rapids. And some of the rapids were good deep water yet. But the sun was going down and down and down. And finally, when it set, we weren't halfway there yet. And here was this bunch there sitting on the far end of the portage. Waiting for us. And it got cooler and cooler, and then the long fingers of mist would spread across the river, and then the moon came up. Oh, I was frantic. And finally, we had a pretty heavy, for that river, pretty heavy rapid. And we had a rock. Oh. And instead of the canoe going up like it swung sideways. So with a current behind it, there's a chance of it capsizing. So Munias over in the front, and I at the back. And we're holding this canoe and trying to swing it around into the current. Well, in the canoe, we had a trunk. We had our effects in. And Dennis was made up in a blanket on the bottom of the canoe. And finally, this canoe, I knew it was all full of water in the bottom and from hitting so many rocks. So I took the boy and these damn blankets and I put him on top of the trunk. And up goes the canoe, and Dennis is in the boiling rapid.
Boy.
Well, sir, I had the moon, and by the grace of God, I reached out like it, and I got a hold of the blanket. and it didn't unwrap. I got a hold of the blanket enough to haul him in. I picked him up. Mooneyers was hanging on the bow of the canoe, and I dumped him in, water and all. And then the canoe swung, and I jumped down. So we got to the foot of the river. It's wide, marshy spot there, and a big flat landing where the portage comes out. And as we approached this place, I thought, I'm scared to go ashore, though. People must be numb in this cold. And here was a wedge of light. There was a teepee there, a moose hunting Indian and his wife. And when the sun went down, he came along to these people and he said, look, it's going to be cold, and your men are not here yet. You better come on in the teepee. And so they went in the teepee. They had black tea and well fed on moose meat, and that's where we found them about 10 o'clock at night. But if I hadn't grabbed that bundle, what would I have told them when I got to the foot of the portage?
We have other stories like that coming up in just a moment. Stand by. And Harold, you were talking about catching Dennis and saving Dennis at that moment, and what you would have said to Elsie if you when you came around that corner. You had many, in some of the things I've read about you, you called him the Grim Reaper. You've had many
scrapes. Yeah, the Grim Reaper. There are times, you know, when you come face to face with a Grim Reaper. You may have misjudged the weather and be caught out from shore in a bad storm, and you get ashore, you may be out on the ice, and the ice suddenly starts to go this way, but you got a chance of doing something about it, fighting back. But there are the insidious dangers that are on. Now, in Stanley, you know, it was as elsewhere. If you wanted fur and you wanted to get a Hudson Bay man, you had to get out and collect it. Just get out and contact your Indians. Spread a yarn around that you're going down the river, and the Hudson Bay man will start off in dawn, in the dark, going down the river to get ahead of you. And as soon as he's gone out of the way, you head north, you see. And
real friendly company.
Oh, yeah, real friendly. And we tripped and traveled all over the country, Malachi and I. And finally, when I got to know the country, and he would take a trip this way, and I'd take a trip the other way. And it's not good country to travel alone, but still, we did it. And rather odd, you know, our family, or branch of the family, the Vern Towle bunch of family, remember Dr.
Yes.
Towle? Our son-in-law and Betty, our daughter, and their youngest boy, Brian, they were up this summer, as they do every year, and they went up to Mississippi, and they flew into, they were supposed to go to Deception Lake. And they were in there 3 or 4 days, and they came back again. They didn't go to Deception, but they went to Missy Lake, big lake, Missy Lake. Oh, Dad, what a beautiful country, and the fish, we brought some back. Oh, really, you should see that country. Well, Dad had seen that country. He saw Missy Lake 50 years ago, and he remembers it. I'd been east of there to over the other side of Maccoon Lake. We used to call it a little reindeer lake, a little deer lake is what it was. And I was making over for Missy Lake, and the camp of Henry Bear was on the north end on a portage. It was about 5 or 6 miles up the lake. And I guess I overstretched it a bit, and the going was tough. It was all snowshoe travel. And the time I hit the lake, I was getting pretty darn tired. Well, what I should have done was to camp right there. Go on in the morning. But I thought, oh, the friendly comfort of Henry's camp. And no, I'm going on. So I pushed on. I didn't need snowshoes on the lake there. I had them taken off and tucked under the lashings of the sleigh, and I followed the dog trail. The dogs followed the dog trail. Now, yes. You take a toboggan and you put it over snow like that and a bunch of dogs and run behind it, and you pack it. You go over again and you pack it. And I guess Henry had used this particular trail, or his boys had, in trapping and moving around. And then thaw had come, you see, and the surrounding snow would settle. And your dog road was a little bit higher than your main road, you see. Yeah. So old Jip, she was my leader, her nose down, and away she goes. She knows she's getting near her settlement. Maybe she smelled it. And I'm hanging onto the headline of the back, and it's pitch dark, and I'm tired, and I'm running along, and bingo, I missed the road, and I'm down into 1.5 feet of snow, you know, and I get up again, and I start off again, and I'm down the other side. A few more steps, and I'm down on my nose in the snow. And, well, after a few wallops like that, you know, you've got the wind knocked out of you. And finally I go down, and I thought, oh boy, is this lovely. It's so nice and warm. I'm so nice and warm, and I'm so darn tired. What I should do is just take 40 winks. And 5 or 10 minutes is all I need, and I wake up fresh. And then something told me, get up, you fool. You shut your eyes for 5 minutes, you'll never open them again. And I guess...
Elaborate on that, because I've heard that type of...
you know, I can understand. You take a man that's going blundering through a blizzard, and his hands are freezing by inches, and his face is frozen, his legs are frozen. What's a horrible death? But to freeze to death because you're tired, that's the most beautiful way to go that ever was. There I was, I laying down there, and I put my head on the old dog road, and I thought, oh, golly, it's nice and warm, and I'm so tired. I get a little sleep in, you know, and I feel fresh. Because if you're traveling day and night, like I've often done that country, if you can grab 5 minutes sleep or 10 minutes sleep, it's all you need. Don't sleep more, you'll wake up doggy, but 10 minutes or you're fresh as a... But anyway, I scared myself. I got up and I grabbed the headline again, and we took off, and I had a few more falls after that, but it wasn't long before we hit the portage, and there were the dogs ahead of us barking their heads off, and the sparks coming out of the old fireplace chimney, and I'm at Henry's camp. And I remember I stopped the dogs, and I banged on the door, and I walked in, and right where I walked in, there was a bunk of peel poles there, and I just flopped on that thing. And I shook my head, and I said, so squashing chuck, any gun, I'm all in. And they looked at me, and Henry said something to his old wife, and she scoops out a cup of black tea. They always got black tea on the hearth. And she brings this over, and she says, you take a drink. So I took a drink of this and a sup of this, and a few more sips and sups at it, and I began to feel a little bit better. And Henry said, look, he said, if you can go and unharness your dogs, he said, and chain them up, he said, the boys will do the rest, they'll unload your sleigh. So I said, I'd do that. So I went out and unharnessed the dogs and chained them up. Their dogs are running loose. If our dogs had been running loose, the other dogs would have torn them to shreds, you know.
No,
but you tie a sleigh dog up like that, and the others won't bother them. It's a funny thing, you know.
Is that right?
I guess they won't pick on a man when he's down, maybe. But anyway, I came back in the cabin. I brought my robe with me, and I threw it on this bunk. And they were boiling some moose meat, and the old lady gives me a drink of moose broth, and I took a drink or two of that, and then I put it down, and I just flopped on a blanket, I dead to the world. I didn't wake up till about 10 o'clock the next morning. But that was a squeaker.
Yes.
If I had not had presence of mind, or
to get up,
somebody upstairs told me, get up, you fool, you're going to freeze to death on me, I'd have had it. So Dad should see Missy Lake. Oh, Dad saw the Missy Lake he wanted.
What about blizzards? You've told me over the years of some of your close scrapes in blizzards.
Well, there was a bad one I ran into. I was coming down Guncoat Bay, as they call it. Comes out of the north, and it's a bay on the Churchill now. Long, deep bay.
Guncoat Bay.
Guncoat Bay, the guncoat, the Spiganagan, the gun case,
yeah.
Moose-eyed gun case, guncoat. They used to spell it G-U-N-C-O-T-E, till I told the map people it should be C-O-A-T, guncoat, for their Spiganagan, the covering of the... Anyway, I'm coming down this thing, and it is snowing, and it's blowing, and on the south shore, the banks are high, and I thought to myself, I got to watch this, because where the bay closes in like that, forming the main stream of the river, there was a rapid there, and the ice is always open. It doesn't freeze very good.
Yeah.
So I said, I don't want to work along here and go into open water. So I stopped the dogs, and I said, I'm going to poke on out and just see if I can find out where I am. So I left the dogs, and I got out, and I had a pole, and I banged on the ice with this, and by golly, finally the pole went through, and I backed up out of there in a hurry, and then this blizzard came on, and it's blowing and howling, and where are the dogs? I can't find the dogs. They're somewhere in a wall of white of the dogs.
Boy.
And you start off in a blizzard trying to find something, you know, you'd probably turn around, you'd go through the ice, you know. So I didn't know north, south, east, or west. So I said, well, maybe it won't last. So I squat down the snow, and I pulled my caribou park around me, and I'm sitting there. And I thought, this is about 8 o'clock at night, and this may keep up all night. By midnight, I'll be frozen stiff. And then old Bill, one of our great old dogs, I guess he got covered with snow, and he got up and he shook himself, and the bells were clashing right over here. Boy, I just took off for a run, and I fell over the dogs and irons. But if I'd stayed there, I'd have frozen to death.
Yeah.
Never leave your dogs in the storm and walk off and hope to find them again. You never will. But
that
Pardon me.
type of danger.
Dangerous, yeah. Step into these, it's your own fool fault. You don't think you're not.
Yeah.
But there was another case. It wasn't. It was a sort
Just
of-
before you get in that, they're giving me the 1 minute, so we might as well take that 1 minute now
Okay,
and come
do
back
that.
to that. Okay, Harold? We'll be back in just a moment. We're with Harold Kemp, and we're just talking about some of the narrow escapes you had, and you were just going to tell us about another one. And
Well, this wasn't a narrow escape. This was a. It had no element of tragedy about it, but it was comical. You look back and you're going to laugh at it, but at the time it was, well, I guess it was serio-comic. It was up in that same country. I had Malachi with me, and we were going up to the Waterman River, and we stayed one night at I think they called it Steep Rock Rapid, Steep Rock Portage, Discovery Powie Stick. And Henry Cook was there, and we stayed this night with Henry Cook, and then we were going on another full day to the Waterman River. Roderick Mackenzie, he was a Hudson Bay man, but there were other trappers there living with him around, all in the same little settlement, and I want to get up there and do some trading with them and collect the furs. So bright and early the next morning, we load up our two sleighs over there, our blankets, and I took the grub box and lashed it on the tail end of the sleigh, and we start off. And after about, I guess 15 or 20 miles, the sun barely cleared the tops of the little old spruce trees, you know. We're going to stop and have a boil up. So we put on a fire and hung the kettle over it and filled it with snow, you know, for a cup of tea. And I go and get the grub box and I bring it in and I dump it down there and throw it open. Grub box? There were half a dozen big number 4 wolf traps in it. That's all it was.
you bought the wrong box.
I bought the wrong box. I grabbed Henry's box, which just about looked like mine, with a baking powder box. That's what they used to use them for grub boxes, put a leather hinge on them. And here we are for breakfast or for dinner or lunch. What are we going to have? A bunch of number 4 wolf traps. So what are we going to do? Malachi looks at me, and I know what he was thinking, too, that dumb white man. But anyway, what are we going to do? Go back for the grub box or go ahead? Well, we had a little council of war. He said, it's just as close to go on. We get up to Roderick's place. They'll have lots of caribou meat and fish, and they'll stake us to come back. So on we go. And evening came on, and it got dark, and we knew we were getting close. And we hit the river, and no dogs are barking, no sparks coming out of the mud and stone fireplace chimney, and the place was deserted. So we went down to the river ice and struck some matches and looked, and sure, under a new coating of snow, there were the toboggan tracks leading north and men's tracks and all. So we knew what it was, that they had been waiting for the caribou to come down and they'd get their supply of meat. And they, as often happens, the migration swings and goes back north. And so they weren't taking any chances. Muhammad and the mountain, if the mountain wouldn't come to Muhammad, they'd go to the mountain, you see. So they all took off. Well, it's no good chasing them. They could be 2 or 3 days away, you know. So we threw on a fire in that fireplace there and melted some snow and had a drink of warm water. And the next day we got 30 or 35 miles to leg it back to Hedges. You know, we'd had one day and a night with nothing to eat, and then back again to Hedges. And we got in there just dark, kind of wobbly, I guess. And as soon as we got in there, they began to laugh. An Indian will laugh at anything, you know. Oh, he'll laugh at misfortune and everything. And oh boy, the grub box. He said, you know, it was until the afternoon, he said, that I saw this box there, and I thought, that doesn't look like mine, and I opened it up, it's your grub box. And he said, we figured out then what would happen. He says, you're all right now, he said. So he said something to the good wife, and she took one of the great big northern whitefish and filleted the thing and mixed up a bunch of batter and turned the fish over and fried it in batter. Yeah, you know, I'd never seen an Indian fry fish in batter before. But I had never tasted anything better before either. You just got to leg it for 24 or 36 hours on an empty belly and anything looks good to you, especially whitefish fried in batter.
Well, you know, we've been spending most of our time, the last 2 programs, on Stanley Mission. And we did mention Mrs. Kemp a number of times. I would like to go back to just to talk. I wanted to have Mrs. Kemp come on, and she says one gabber in the family's enough. And
words to that effect,
You're a
yes.
pretty good gabber. But you told me once that Mrs. Kemp said this was the happiest
It
time
was.
of her life.
It was. There was social life there, you know. And in the wintertime, we would trap, and she had the 3 young kids in her family life, and she was a little more than a girl herself at the time. And then she had Betsy there, and Betsy taught her Cree, and she would learn. She'd teach Betsy English, you know. And they had a lot of fun, a lot of fun. And then in the summertime, the Indians would all pitch in again, as they called it, from their winter camps, and there was activity there. There was a nightly football game, and the kids were running around with their bows and arrows, and there was a square dance pretty nearly every second night in the week in the houses.
Can your daughter Betty talk Cree? Can all the kids?
Betty wasn't born yet. She came along later.
She was the last born in Prince Albert, yeah.
And we'd have these hoedowns there, and then we'd push the freight in the warehouse. In the summertime, it's getting a little low. We'd push that to one side, and Betcha now she'd cook up a bunch of cookies or cake or something, and boil tea, and we'd have a lunch there. We'd dance there, and square dance there till all coming daylight in the morning.
Is that where you got your radio in, Stanley? Is that where you picked up the violin? Because in our next chapter,
yeah, no, I tell you, that came when I was at L'Orange. Remember, I said I spent most of my life there away from this happy married couple with a mewling baby. I was up in my room, and I read so much, and I wrote so much, and then I bought a fiddle. And I'd scrape away on this thing trying to, and I had an accordion. I started to learn to play that, and an auto harp. Well, if they didn't appreciate me downstairs, they appreciated my attempts at music a lot less. But anyway, that's where I picked up the fiddle, and I called the square dances. They'd call square dances themselves. They didn't know what they were saying, but they'd, my left and the lady on the left. They didn't know what they were saying, but we'd have a whale of a good time in the summertime. And then, as I say, winter came along, and well, we earned the rest, and we enjoyed it, and we'd trap and so on, you know. And
Kenny Bird, our cameraman, was saying that they got a road into Stanley.
Yeah,
almost completed.
Road into Stanley, you know, Jack. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but they're exploiting the North, and I'm not with it at all. I take all those settlements in the North, and I'm not going to name them. As soon as they got a road through there, there's a government beer parlor, and you've had it.
Is that right?
The white man goes in there, and he's not always the best type. Don't look at me either. but in Stanley, the finest people in the world, but they'll put a road through there, and the tourists will go there, and the paddlers, and they'll be through there, and the odd man.
Well,
Here,
Kenny's a paddler, so what?
Well, have a little nip,
Yeah.
and they'll have a little nip, and then there's the beer parlors there. The Indian can buy all the liquor he wants, and unless they are very, very firm in their
There was no
belief.
alcohol.
No.
Nothing at all, eh?
Well, I tell you, a few of the younger guys there, they found out the potency of a yeast cake and some raisins and currants and cranberries, you know. You boil that up into a mash and you stew it off, and you get something. But they didn't brew all summer long. Once in a while, they make themselves a little mash, you know. But most of the people wouldn't bother. There were 2 or 3 of the young guys.
Yeah.
They used to like a little.
But there was no problem.
No booze at all, no.
What year was it when you decided that you
Well,
must
it
leave
came
Stanley?
1927, you know, and our kids were growing up. The oldest was 9, and the next one, I guess, was between 7 and 8, and young Dennis was rising 6. And to educate them, Elsie sent out to Regina for the correspondence school course, and that is you teach them yourselves. Well, you try to teach these kids A, B, C, and they'd look through the window and hear their Indian pals out there with their bows and arrows chasing chickadees. You couldn't get to first base. The time had come, we realized it. Either I ship the family out to town, put the kids to school, or I go out and we quit the North.
And that's where we have to leave today, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back with our next chapter with Harold Kemp very soon. Glad you joined us today. Thank you. Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. It's time to spend another few minutes with Mr. Harold Kemp. Harold Stewart Miller Kemp, H.S.M. Kemp. And he's sort of like an institution in this part of the country. And I want to apologize right now because I'm supposed to be guiding the program, and I let this guy Kemp
miss out two big chunks that we just seem to get at and not get at, as a matter of fact. So, Harold, the first thing we want to do is say we finished with Stanley.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a great time talking about that. But you took a picture. I don't know whether we can have a look at this picture. We have a slide of a picture you took in 1911. Oh, there it is.
With a box camera, $1 camera.
A $1 camera.
Yeah.
And that's the original tower and
And the Gothic arches and the tall steeple, yeah.
now people don't see that now. We see the new
Yeah,
version.
that's right. He
of it.
cut it all off below those arches and ruined the thing.
All right. Well, we just wanted to show you that picture. George Slingsby took a picture of a picture and made this slide for us. And there's the Stanley Church, way back in 1911, taken with a $1 box camera.
Yep.
My
Oh,
God.
we took. Yep.
Now, you sort of skipped some stuff.
You say
And I don't want you to do that again. We
you say
missed
that I-
Ile La Crosse and Red Earth Indian Reserve.
I thought that I gave that.
No, you didn't.
Okay, we'll give it again. And if I'm selling your audience, if any, a dead horse, well, that's just too bad. Well, anyway, I think that I mentioned that I was getting pretty well disgusted with the homestead. Dad was back from overseas, and I helped him put in his crop, and I was scratching around on my own place. And then we had a visitor, John H. Reed, Jack Reed. He was a colorful character. He was about 6'2" there, with square jaw and hard black eyes, and he was had been running the post at Ile La Crosse, the biggest in the district. And then Lamson Hubbard came to him and asked him if he would take over the managership of the old Saskatchewan district for this new company. Jack said yes. Now, Jack had a dash of Indian blood in him, and boy was he proud of it. He took the census one time up there, and he was appointed to take the census. And the first name on the list was J.H. Reed, nationality half-breed. No, he didn't mince words.
He didn't mince words. Half-breed.
Oh, half-breed. None of this matey stuff for him. He was a half-breed. But you'd never know it. He was educated at St. John's College, Winnipeg. And anyway, he came on the farm, and he said, "What are you messing around with this homestead stuff for?" I said, "Well," I said, "what else? Come in with us." He said, "We're opening posts in the north." And oh, he went on and painted a beautiful picture. And I noticed that Elsie was getting a little impressed with this. So,
Mama.
Mama. So, some days afterwards, I told Elsie, to heck with this mug's game of homesteading here. I'm going to go and see Jack Reed, talk to him, see what he's got to offer." And Elsie says, "Well, okay." So I go and see Jack. Yeah, well, they just opened the post at Ile La Crosse. They put a man in there. He was a greenhorn, but he was a pretty fair businessman. He knew nothing about fur, but he would pick it up. And I could go in there as an assistant to him. And they were building 2 or 3 more posts, and when they were finished, this guy might be shunted over to one of these posts, and I'd take over Ile La Crosse, or if I wanted to go over there. So I said, okay. So he said, when? So I said, well, when? He said, well, any time at all. I said, okay, we'll wind things up. So I went back home, and I said, well, you're going down north. She says, where? I said, Ile La Crosse. Oh. So that was that. So
Is that all she said?
Oh,
No
that's all
argument?
she said. No argument. Whither thou goest, I will go, you know. Oh, biblical. So anyway, I turned the team of horses and the cow and the yearling calf over to Dad and told the settlement board I was pulling out of there. And
You were a lousy farmer. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Farmer. You call me a farmer. I didn't know the first thing. Anyway, I go back and I see Jack Reed. And here are my notes in case I get balled up, you know. So I go back and see Jack Reed, and he said, when do you want to start? I said, anytime. He said, all right, tomorrow. I said, okay. Now, I said, what's the proposition
deal?
now? Yeah. Well, he said, you take the train to Big River, yeah? And he said, the IC Fish Company are agents there, and they got a 18-foot canoe waiting for him. Pile in and go. I said, what do you mean pile in and go? 150 miles. I said, he said, you can paddle, can't you? I said, am I going to paddle my wife and kids and all this stuff 150 miles? I said, you're crazy. Well, he says, there's nothing to it. There's only one lake and one river. You can't get lost. Well, that was a little bit of an exaggeration. I said, well, oh, I said, this is the screwiest setup that I've ever heard. I said, I've seen you travel in the north. I said, talk about the Governor General traveling around. So he said, well, he says, it's not as bad as you think it is. He says, do you know old John Monroe? Yeah, old John Monroe, he had a kind of a bit of a stopping place at Ile La Crosse, and he had a few candy bars and at a pool table, and yeah, I knew John Monroe. Well, he said he's going north, and he's taking Fred Redhead with him. I said, who's Fred Redhead? Well, he said he's going to run our post of Buffalo now. So he said, you all go down together. He said, oh, it's one big happy family. Hey, yeah. Okay.
Does he have a son, Fred Redhead, in town right now?
Well,
Is a Fred Redhead?
He'd be a son or a grandson.
Sure, for heaven's sakes. I know Fred Redhead.
Do you?
The young fella.
Oh, well, we get up to a big river, and there was the canoe, and here's old John Monroe and Fred. So, hey, this is good. Old John Monroe had got one of these newfangled outboard motors, a square tank, even rood, you know, solid cast iron and brass, weigh about 80 pounds.
No paddles.
So he said, we'll tow you up, he said, to the end of Cowan Lake. What is it, about 30 miles? And from the end, it's pretty well downstream, he said. And there's rapids. We may not use the motor too much, but we'll all travel together. Well, that's fine. So he hooked onto me, and up we go. We go up to Cowan Lake, and we get to the north end of the lake, and there's a dam there, dammed off. You see, there was a big mill at Big River, and this lumber company, they had to have a constant head of water. They'd boom their logs down there and up the jack ladder, you know, and into the mill. But so they dammed the Cowan River where it flowed out of the lake, and they got this constant head of water. But the catch was that when you got to the dam, you would tell the dam keeper what you needed, and you'd camp there overnight, and then he'd open the gates and let a flood of water go down. And then the next morning, you'd pull out on this flood of water, and you'd get on down the Cowan River, and finally you'd hit Beaver River. But of course the catch was you had to keep scratching and get down to the Beaver before you shut the gates entirely, you know, and
turn the water off.
Dry, yeah, like the Ark on top of Mount Ararat. Yeah. So anyway, we pulled out, and we noticed towards the afternoon, the river was getting lower. We were seeing more rocks than we ever saw before. But
Scraping bottom?
Yeah.
Scraping bottom?
Oh, of course. You mean the bottom of the canoe?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yes, I mean the bottom of the canoe.
oh, yeah. So we got to the Beaver, and then we went on down from there. The Grand Rapids and past La Plonge, and we had lousy weather. We'd have to tie up for an hour or so when the thunderstorms came on. Finally, we got to Ile La Crosse Lake. And here the lake was just a mass of rolling white caps. There's no chance to get here across. And we were getting short of grub. We were always short of grub. I don't know. I guess
You had the wife and the kids with you.
Yeah, the wife and the kids, and I guess I was a poor caterer. We always ran short. Anyway, old John Monroe, he'd taken in with him a couple of cases of eggs and a couple of cases of oranges. And so we had to dig into the eggs and the oranges. And however, we got halfway across the lake. The wind went down the next day, and over on the far shore against the spruce, here's little white dots. And I said to Elsie, well, there you are. She says, what am I? I said, well, Ile La Crosse. And she took a look. And she said, is that Ile La Crosse? Oh, she'd known PA and a few more towns, London. She looked, that's Ile La Crosse. Well, I said, cheer up. I said, it'll look different when you get there. So we went on. And the odd thing about Ile La Crosse is the Hudson's Bay Post is in a nice green timber. But there's a sand spit that runs out. And the houses on the Rivion store and the Mission, they're all built out on this sand spit. And you get a mile from shore, and you swear they're all sitting in the water, you see?
We'll come back to Ile La Crosse in just a minute. Stand by when we take this break for a message. The North I Once Knew with Harold Kemp, and this is about our 5th or 6th program, and we're at Ile La Crosse, and you're just approaching Ile La Crosse, and
That's right.
you're dismayed, at least Mrs. Kemp is dismayed with the smallness of this settlement. And so what happened?
Well, we landed on this sand spit. And when you get in there, oh, it looks normal enough. And the Lamson Hubbard man there, he had a house picked out for us, and which was an old house, but very comfortable. And so that was that. So we got settled in there. And you know, at Ile La Crosse, they're all French half-breeds in the settlement. And then our customers around the country are either Crees or Chippewyans.
Mm-hmm.
And there was very little debt given out, so I didn't have much running around to do. But I had a string of dogs. And old Jack Rosser and his wife was there, and her kids, and the boys that were running the Réveillon post were there, and they were very, very nice people in the settlement. And, oh, it was a lovely time all around, but I do not remember any outstanding episode of all the time we're there. Except I do remember that I had to take a trip. We had a little outpost at Canoe Lake. And oh, by the way, in the meantime, the manager's wife had fallen very sick, ill, and he had to take her out. And that left me to run the joint. So I took the dogs and I went out to Canoe Lake. And I was out there for a couple of hours, I guess, and had a lunch with the Indian boy that was running this place. And then I started back for home. And as I left, it began to snow. And I was about 25 miles to go. And by the time we hit the first portage, the snow deep, deep, deep. And I thought I would get a little bit leg weary and tired. I thought I should have brought a lunch along. Then I remembered, by golly, coming up, there was a tarp over a cache of goods. Hudson Bay Company's goods, HBC printed on the tarp. And I said, that's fine. When I get there, I'm going to dig into that cache. I'm going to starve to death on the road. So, well, I got to this place, and I started a nice fire going and hung a kettle of snow over the top to thaw. And I threw back the tarp. What'll it be? Pelican beans or biscuits, or what are we going to have? There were half a dozen 5-gallon cans of coal oil in wooden boxes. Coal oil. I needed coal oil.
And you're not a drinking man.
I threw the tarp back on, and anyway. But I can't remember anything else. We were very, very, very ordinary living up there. But along towards spring and March, I began to hear some disquieting news. This company wasn't as solid as it should be. And the next thing I know, somebody told me that they were going out of business, and Jack Reed he'd quit and he'd gone down north someplace. And I got a letter from them. They were going to suspend operations for a while, and they were sending in a man in a kind of caretaker capacity, and would I come out to Prince Albert? Well, that meant I was fired, you see. Yeah. Here we go again. So we hired a team, and I get back to PA. And what am I going to do? I'm sure not going back to any homestead. And all of a sudden, I had an idea, and I went down to the Réveillon office in town, and P.D. Walker was the man in charge, and I told him my troubles. I said, do you think there's any chance of catching on with the company again? Oh, he said, I think so. And so he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, I'll write to John Keith in Edmonton. John Keith, he was the bull of the woods of the whole outfit, you know. And he said, we'll see what he's got to say. So not long afterwards, word came back, yes, if I would work in the office there for a month or so, a vacancy would be coming up, and they would contact me. So I worked in the office, and Elsie and the kids stayed with her people, and then John Keith came down after about a month, and he said, how'd you like to go to Red Earth? I said, Red Earth? I said, where's Red Earth? Oh, he said, he told me where it was, and he said, you know, we had a little trouble with that place. And I said, oh, how come? Well, he said, there's no Frenchman running it, he said, a fellow named Godin. And he said, you know, last year he only got $1,800 worth of fur. And you can't run a trading post on $1,800 worth of fur, huh? So I said, no, that's right. So he said, we don't know whether to shut the place up or not. Or he said, you go down there. And he said, see if you can get $1,800 worth of fur. And he said, if you get more than that, he said, we'll reward you accordingly. And I said, if I get less than 1,800, he says, you'll be looking for another job. Well,
They didn't mince words and all.
no, that's everything in a nutshell, you see. So that was fine. So to get to the Red Earth now, you just hop in your car, you drive to Nipawin and 50 or 60 miles the other side, and you're there. But in those days, though, you went to the Paw.
I see.
All around about on the railroad. Then you came up to Saskatchewan a few miles, and then you turned into that snaky, crooked Carrot River. And about 100 miles up the river, through ash and elm and oak, altogether different
Terrain.
it is to here. You're Manitoba there, or very close to it. And we landed finally at Red Earth. And the day after we got there, the old boy pulls out. Oh, we went up in a power boat that was going up that way. And the power boat was coming back, and the old boy, he and his wife, they pull out, and I'm in charge of Red Earth Post, $1,800 worth of fur. Well, as he said, they did have a nice house, whitewashed squared logs, and they had a nice whitewashed log store. And the next morning, I go into the store. I opened the door, and oh boy, what a beautiful smell. Moose hides, fur, tobacco, everything you could think of. The smell of the North.
Yes.
You don't get that anymore. Oh boy, was that a lovely aroma. So I went inside and I began to look around, and 3 Indians came in, a couple of youngish guys and an old man, and Watchie, they shake hands all around and set up on the counter. And the old man there, he goes to have a smoke. And so he pulls a fire bag out from under his L'Assomption belt, you know. And by the way, do you know what a L'Assomption belt is?
No, I was going to say, what's a
Well, do you know what a fire bag is?
No.
Of course, you don't know much, do you, Jeff? You were born 40 years too late. Well, this L'Assomption sashes, they're factory-made yarn, you know, about 6 feet long, and 8 inches or a foot wide, very, very colorful with long tassels, fringes on them. And the Indians, they take them, they wrap these things around their hips to hold their pants up, not around the waist. Only a woman puts a belt around the waist. Man got to come around the hips.
I see.
I learned that early. So then his fire bag is a bag that he carries his pipe and his tobacco and maybe a knife and so on and so on. And he pulls this thing out, you know, and he whittles some tobacco off a plug, and he fills his pipe, and then he goes back into a little container and he puts something on top of that. And then he's all ready to go. Do you know what he pulled out?
No.
A flint and steel.
No
A
kidding.
flint and steel in the year of our Lord, 1921. So he's up on his pipe, and finally a spark comes. He puts his hand over it. He's in business. He's starting to smoke. Flint and steel.
We'll be back in business at Red Earth in just a minute. Stand by. We're spending some moments reminiscing with just a great guy, Mr. Harold Kemp, and he is talking about the North he once knew. And I'm sure that the people around Carrot River and Nipawin and Red Earth will be most excited about what you're going to say next.
Oh,
Back
yeah.
in 1921.
1921.
Red Earth Reserve.
So here's this old boy with his flint and steel. He's got his pipe going, you know. And I found out afterwards that the people there, they would buy matches from us, you know, the old sulfur matches. You'd strike them and hold them at arm's length, you know, the stinking things until the sulfur was born and the burned and the wood caught. Well, they would use those, but so many of them depended on the old flint and steel. And then I found out later that there were very, very few modern rifles in the place. It was the old muzzle-loading guns.
No kidding.
Muzzle-loading guns, and I didn't see a white man's canoe in the place belonging to those Indians. All birch bark canoes. Flint and steel, muzzle-loading guns, birch bark canoes.
They were back in 1850 almost.
Back in time. And you know, the funny part was that 60 miles over the Paw Mountain, there was Hudson Bay Junction with its howling, screaming sawmills, and 60 or 70 miles up the Cart, you were into the farming country, Cart River farming country. The other way northeast, another 50, 60 miles, and you're into Cumberland House. Cumberland House, the people there,
200 years they've been there.
Oh, yeah, sure. And they had their repeating rifles and their gramophones and sewing machines, and the girls used to order their finer clothing from Teton's, Winnipeg. And in this little backwater is this bunch of Indians there with their, you know, flint and steel and so on. Well, sir, you know, I thought it was the funniest thing that I'd ever run into. But, however, I sized things up, and then I remembered about this $1,800 worth of fur. So the first thing I did was to get a string of 5 dogs together and a good big toboggan and harness, and then I would start running around the country again. Now, John Keith told me, he says, now you remember, this is a no-debt post, no debt. Now I said, okay. So you know why? I said, no. Well, he said, it's not bad during the winter, but then you'll commit yourself if you give debt. But the thing is this, in the spring of the year, he said, the Cart River has its headwaters up in Waterhen Lake or somewhere up there near Valparaiso. And in the spring, he said, the Waterhen has a habit 3 times out of 4 of overflowing its banks. And then the Cart River comes down a real torrent and it floods that whole country. And if the Indians are out there trapping, they lose their camps and they lose their traps, they lose everything. So he said, you don't give debt. He says, you'll get stuck and you never get paid.
No credit.
No credit, credit. In our time it was debt. Yeah. So I said, okay, Mr. Keith, no debt. Yes, sir, no debt. So I get down, and I hadn't been there too long, and I have a delegation come to me and said, we're going out on the moose hunt, and we'd like a little debt. Well, I said, what is this moose hunt? Well, it seemed that the Indians would go out there and they would shoot their moose, and they would make them, smoke the meat or make it into pemmican, or they would, and then they'd take the hides and they'd tan them into soft leather. And that was a marvelous moose country. Gosh, you know, with those 5 dogs of ours, there were no fish down that country. We fed them raw moose meat. Mm-hmm. They were like a bunch of wolves. You had to keep them tied up all the time, raw meat eaters, you know. Mm-hmm. So if I would give them a little debt, they would pay me back in leather. Well, I thought I got to get a toe in the door somewhere. Sure, I'll give you some debt. So I give them a little for ammunition and tea and so on. And they went out on this moose hunt. They weren't gone too long, I guess 2 or 3 weeks, and they came back and they paid me in leather. Boy, did I have moose hides clear to the roof. I wondered, what am I going to do with all these moose hides? And then I found I was lucky. The post in the north, you know, in the rock country, in the Sinisco, as they call it, that's not a moose country. And the Indians up there, they were always hard-pressed for moose for their moccasins and their gloves and their coats and so on. They're always looking for moose hides. The upshot was that by giving out a little debt, I supplied all those posts with moose hides, you see. Well, then that was out of the way. And then the next thing was the duck hunt. What is this duck hunt? Well, they go back into the swamps and the lakes, and they slaughter ducks by the 100. And the feathers and the down go into robes, you know, and they would smoke the meat, and then the ducks were fat, then they'd render them down into fat, you see. And this they would bag up into bags they made out of the main gut of the moose, you see. So then they'd be well fixed. Well, they came back from that. I gave them a little debt. And they came back and they said, well, I guess you're not interested in feathers. No, I didn't. I sure didn't need feathers. So, well, he says, now the rat hunt begins.
What's the rat hunt?
The rat hunt, the muskrat hunt. They'd start muskrat trapping, you see, fall rats. So I said, so what? I said, well, we'd like a little debt. Now, John says, if you give him debt, you're committed, and you are. You give an Indian debt, and then after you cut him off, well, he'll get sore, and he'll go over to the other guy, you see, and you're left holding the bag. So I said, okay, we'll give you debt. So they went off into the country on this rat hunt. And boy, did I get rats that year. I had 3,000 or 4,000 of the things, you know. And just about that time, an Indian came up from the paw, and he said, here's your mail. And I took the mail, and going down the cost of the various fur, what I was authorized to pay, and I got down to muskrats, closed season. And here's with me with 4,000 illegal rats. And to buck me up a little bit, the Indian says, the Samagonist is on his way up, the policeman. I said, when's he going to get here? Well, he said, he was going to leave the day after me. He said, he'll be here tomorrow. Boy, I talked to him. I says, what are we going to do, 4,000 rats? I said, put me in the pen for life. So I had an idea. I got two great big boxes, and I put these rats flat in it, you know, and then I put a lid on them. These two boxes. And then we had a massive wood pile out the back. I'd hired the Indians to saw this wood up into cook stove length, and there it was. So I scratched a hole in this wood pile, and I pushed my boxes in, and the rats in there, and I shoved the whole wood pile over on top of them. Well, I've still got about 1,000 that I haven't disposed of yet. So what am I going to do with them? Well, our house was lined with beaver board, you see, like this here, and paneling and slats down the side. So I took a slat off and I pried the beaver board loose, and I took these rats, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I fired them in behind the beaver board. I nailed it up again. Well, the next day the cop turns up. Constable Phil Power, an Irishman with jaw like that, you know. Oh, a great guy, university educated, but a tough guy. So he came into the house, sits down, and he said, how's things? Oh, good. Getting lots of fur. I'm getting my share. Of course, not much fur yet, you know, Phil. I said, a few foxes and that. He said, how about the rats? I said, rats? What do you mean rats? I said, rats are clothes. I wish they weren't. I could have got lots. He said, you didn't buy any rats? I said, of course I didn't buy rats. He said, I think I'll look around. I said, help yourself. Be my guest. Come on. So he goes up to the store, and he looks and pokes around. Well, there wasn't much room there for it. He goes upstairs, and here's a bunch of fur hanging up. And, gosh, he says, I don't know. I guess you didn't buy any. I said, I didn't buy any. Well, that's fine. So we go down to the house, and we have supper, and Phil tips his chair back against the wall. The thickness of a beaver board, he has 1,000 rats. Now, well, I hope it doesn't get too hot. They start to smell. Yeah. But anyway, pardon me. That's fine. Phil pulls out the next day, and afterwards he quit the police, and that was the Saskatchewan provincial police, you see, in those days. And he got posted to Montreal Lake for Réveillons. And I'm at Montreal Lake one time, and I camped with Phil overnight, and he said, now look.
Tell me.
Tell me. They've all come out. How many rats did you buy? I said, I told you I didn't buy rats. Ah, come off. He said, you had them. You had them. He said, if I'd ever found them, I'd thrown the book at you. However, after Phil had gone there, I bailed these rats out, and I smuggled them out to the pond. They got overseas and finally on the London market.
And this is where we're going to have to leave Mr. Harold Kemp until next time, when we again reminisce about the North he once knew. So stand by for the next show. Thanks for watching.